Greetings. I thought I would record some of the classes, some of the lectures from the classes that I was actually present for. And so I wanted to start with the last one that I did, which is really about compassion fatigue. And so I think it's a good place to start to really begin to look at, if I can get this kind of set up here. So if you look at this trauma continuum, this is what I established. I developed this when I was in my doctoral program, and I was reading so much about trauma and about different kinds of trauma and all these different issues, and I wanted to have a sense of where it all fit together. And so I developed this probably in 1993, 94. And so looking at primary trauma is the trauma of the primary trauma survivor. And so post-traumatic stress disorder and developmental trauma are both things that I would consider primary traumas. Secondary trauma is the trauma that is associated with our interactions with people we care about and the stories that they tell. And there's two different kinds of secondary trauma. One is vicarious trauma, which is kind of an infectious kind of process where if I spend a lot of time with clients who are significantly traumatized, that I will, based on how much stress I have, based on how much burnout I have, will impact where I'll begin to take on some of the symptoms that the client has. And then the other is chiasmal trauma, and that is a process where one person's trauma can end up impacting an entire team of people. So then we get to compassion fatigue, which is secondary trauma and burnout. Well, so that's what we're going to talk about today. And then the last one is organizational trauma, and that idea of if we have enough traumatized people, if we have enough people with compassion fatigue in an organization, the more we begin to see symptoms of various employees beginning to impact the overall well-being of the staff and the operation of the environment of the organization. So people will ask me, why do you call it compassion fatigue rather than empathy fatigue? Isn't it driven on the fact that we care about our clients? And Carla Joinson, who is the person who coined the term compassion fatigue, I'll talk about her in a few minutes a little bit more, was very adamant that it is not about empathy, it's about compassion. And compassion refers to the deep awareness of the suffering of others coupled with our wish to relieve it. And if you look at the red text there, Carla chose this term to emphasize the emotional toil of constantly caring for patients in distress rather than the cognitive efforts of empathizing with them. Empathy is that sort of co-experiencing, understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and the vicarious experience of the feelings, thoughts, experiences of our client. And we have to have empathy in order to have compassion. But again, Joinson, who was a professor at UCLA, she was doing research in the School of Nursing. She was studying the secondary trauma of nurses in intensive care units and in emergency rooms. And she coined the term believing that compassion fatigue was about burnout. And I was at Florida State. We were studying secondary trauma. I was studying the secondary trauma of parents of children who experience pediatric intensive care. Dr. Figley was working on a variety of projects, and other people were working on other projects as well. And Dr. Joinson, or Carla Joinson, sent a letter to Dr. Figley saying, it's really interesting, I've been watching what you guys are doing in your clinic, and what you call secondary trauma, we call compassion fatigue. And we were meeting as a team talking about that and how much we liked the term compassion fatigue as a way of kind of delineating the kind of secondary trauma of health care workers, of therapists, of nurses, doctors, um, firefighters, police officers, and lawyers. And so um, when she wrote the first article on compassion fatigue in 1992, she said there are 4 things that make compassion fatigue so important for us to be aware of in the helping professions. And the first one is that compassion fatigue is emotionally devastating, that we experience great sadness and grief and depression and exhaustion um, from working with clients who are in significant distress or telling us stories of significant overwhelm. Um, Families experience compassion fatigue as well. That's another lecture. Number 2, caregivers' personalities lead us to it. That if we don't have empathy, if we don't have compassion, we're pretty safe to not get this. But the fact that you're here, and the fact that you're watching this video, and the fact that you're wanting to be a part of the helping professions tells me that your personalities will lead you to it as well. The third one is that outside sources that cause it are unavoidable, and that they're the stories of death or trauma, grief, guilt, anxiety, conflict, high stress, etc. Compassion fatigue, number 4, is almost impossible to recognize without a heightened awareness of it. And so we always say that the last person to know that they have compassion fatigue is the person who has it, that everyone around them recognizes that they have it, but they do not. And so when we begin to look at this, we can see how it can begin to really kind of rock the foundation that healthcare workers, addiction counselors, social workers, whatever, marriage and family therapists can we build our careers on. We build our ability to bear witness to our traumatized clients. And so this kind of cracks that foundation. So I guess the best way to look at it is I use the infinity symbol, because compassion fatigue is actually the combination of burnout and secondary trauma. And burnout is what we would call organizational stressors. And organizational stressors are stressors that result from the work environment. Policies and procedures, kind of rules, limitations, difficult clients, caseloads, management styles, all of those kinds of things. And secondary trauma is what we call operational stressors. And operational stressors are our interactions with our clients and the stories that we hear and the examples that we're kind of faced with on a regular basis. And so I tend to see it as it happens in one of 2 ways. I think it's really different for families that get it. I think that for families, the more secondary trauma and the adaptation of the family to a progressing chronic progressive illness kind of leads to burnout. In our world, that the more burnout we have, the more stress we have, the more we're constantly trying to kind of live with, deal with, alter, change, adjust to the demands in our work environment, that the greater our likelihood of becoming secondary trauma survivors. And so I kind of think of it in terms of energy. We only have so much energy. And I use the term ego energy, the idea of knowing where I end and where my client begins. And so the more exhausted I am, the less of that energy I have to be able to say, I'm going to bear witness, and we are going to kind of sit with our client and their trauma. But it can happen the other way around as well. Sometimes our clients will tell us, give us an example of a trauma that they've experienced that is so significant that it has that it traumatizes us. And when we think about trauma memories and how trauma memories work, and how we are actually triggered by sensory information that places and familiar things and familiar people and those kinds of things that trigger the trauma response, sight, sounds, smells, those things, that walking back into our office may be a significant trigger for us. So that the more trauma we have, the more energy it takes for us to get up, get to work, and go back into that environment. And it's been my experience that, absenteeism is a big issue, but not just absenteeism, but like showing up at work, what I call on the job absenteeism, that people show up, but they don't do the work that they're doing. They're pretty overwhelmed by all of that material. So let's jump into a discussion of burnout. And so, if you look at the definition of burnout, there are a couple. I think the more classic definition is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. I think what we're beginning to look at in terms of from a compassion fatigue standpoint, that it's the negative effects the environmental demands of our workplace have on the worker's well-being. And so the fact that we're dealing with difficult clients every day, it doesn't matter whether you're working inpatient, outpatient, residential, whatever, that, the stories that we hear, the fact that we care, make it that much harder. The term that I really like better than burnout is what Kotler said. And he says, burnout implies that it happens quickly, kind of like flaming out. And Kotler said that it's really more of a rust out kind of a process, that it happens really slowly. And so often things will rust without us even being aware of it. And he said, rust out is a much better term because it better represents the slow, gradual process that eats away at the caregiver's spirit. And I think that speaks really volumes about we don't even know it's happening until someone who that we work with that cares about us says, hold on a second, like you're different. Like you used to be around us. You used to have lunch with us. We used to talk, but you seem to be isolating. You seem to be avoiding, and so we begin to see symptoms that are trauma symptoms, if you will. So burnout from a work perspective, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One is from the personal burnout perspective, and it says on a personal level, burnout is a leading cause of reduced compassion satisfaction. And compassion satisfaction is the term that we use when talking about compassion fatigue and the lack of job satisfaction. It's one of the highest reasons why people quit their jobs, why people leave working in one environment thinking going to another environment's a better option. Excuse me. And from an organizational level, the more employees who have burnout, the greater the employee perception that they work in a place that has a toxic workplace. And that usually results in, that's the foundation for organizational trauma. The more employees we have with pretty significant exhaustion, the more we see gossip, the more we see conflict, the more turnover. We're constantly replacing employees, the more entitlement that folks have. So what are the primary symptoms of burnout? Well, there are three, and those three go pretty in this order pretty consistently. The first is disillusionment, related to a sense of ineffectiveness or a lack of accomplishment. If you think back to my comment about compassion rather than empathy, compassion is working with these difficult cases, but also maintaining this belief that somehow you're going to be able to help them. Well, a lot of times, we deal with lapse. We deal with individuals who, leave AMA, people who have overdoses, and we deal with overdose deaths from certain periods of time. And so we begin to feel, boy, I'm not as good at this as I thought I was going to be. And I think it's really important for everyone who's entering the field, particularly, into the CAT in the CAS world to really begin to look at how how much of how much influence did you think you would have? And I think that's a really important question. So the greater imagined success and the greater the imagined influence, the greater the potential for disillusionment. And so if I'll use the example of a person in recovery who has been a really good sponsor and really been effective at helping people in the program, may find out that in treatment, it's a completely different world. It's a completely different set of requirements. And so beginning to feel that we're not doing a good job. And what we find is people either decide, I need to do a lot more work, and so that they can't leave work behind. They're thinking about it when they go home. When they could be playing with their kids, they're thinking about that client that they saw today. And others, they don't go home. They just stay and they work more hours, and they become more and more committed to being at the treatment environment, which that kind of work leads to exhaustion. And so when we begin to look at, many agencies, for whatever financial reason, are really needing to do more service with less employees and less resources. And so, that has a likelihood of causing exhaustion. But also the idea of, if I'm disillusioned and I don't feel empowered and I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job, it takes twice as much energy to go to work every day. And so exhaustion is the resulting physiological response to working in an environment that I'm not feeling very good about. And the third one is cynicism. And cynicism is that the definition I loved, someone said that cynicism is thinly disguised contempt. It's a kind of a passive-aggressive, angry, negative comment that is usually given under the guise of, I was just kidding. I was making a joke. Lighten up. Don't be so touchy. Don't be so, defensive. But the idea of cynicism is what we experience when we don't feel empowered enough to actually give our opinions, and we don't feel that our feedback is well received, or that we have the ability to influence the work environment. And so these are the three primary signs of burnout. But if you look at the blue box there, there's recent research. This research that I'm going to cite from 2020. And this is really kind of food for thought. And we know that individuals who have a trauma history, people who kind of grew up in environments of developmental trauma, where they have learned to care so much for others, and that, individuals' the needs of others become more important than our own needs, that 2/3 of the variance, or 2/3 of what we're seeing with burnout, are really attributed to the employee's individual life circumstances, like their own depression, their own burnout or exhaustion, is tied to their own emotional history. And only 1/3 is attributed to the workplace. So we're kind of evolving, and we'll talk a little bit here in a few minutes about who's most likely to get this. Some of the things that employees talk about, that cause burnout, and again, these are organizational stressors. And stressors are anything that requires a demand that you have to deal with. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're horribly difficult, but in most cases they are things that push us to need to cope with them. So a lack of control in the workplace, a lack of empowerment, too much change, a management culture of unfairness, where they seem to play favorites, or they seem to promote friends rather than promote people that really feel that they have done the work necessary to get that promotion. Poor communication, either a lack of collaboration or too much collaboration, insufficient orientation to the organization, insufficient orientation to the job itself. I call the 5 R's: rules, roles, rituals, routines, and relationships. And that we get so often, particularly out on the Western Slope, where there just aren't very many professionals, that often people are hired and moved too quickly into the work environment. Okay, now let's look at secondary trauma. So this is a couple quotes from Charles Figley and I. Figley was my mentor, Charles Figley, and he wrote the first book on compassion fatigue in counselors. And I had the good fortune of being a student and being able to edit and work on the book, so that was pretty exciting. And so these 2 quotes really kind of explain secondary trauma. One is, when the primary trauma survivor experiences symptoms that are directly associated with some aspect of a traumatic event, remember, sensory experiences, sights and sounds and smells and tastes, those things that trigger the trauma symptoms of the primary survivor, the secondary trauma survivor, the family members, the therapists, the helpers, experience symptoms that are associated with the primary trauma survivor. So if you look at the picture and you see that young woman sitting, talking to a young therapist, that the material that they're talking about, the emotional response that client has a pretty significant impact on the well-being and the secondary trauma of the therapist. And the second quote is, while traumatization may be a primarily linear process, and that means that an event happens, a person experiences it, a person has symptoms, a person goes to therapy. That's a linear process. The maintenance of traumatic stress symptoms is a systemic process, or what we call in family therapy a recursive process, between the primary survivor and those who interact with them. And so rather than that linear process, an event happens, person is traumatized, the people that interact with them are reacting to the secondary trauma of the client, or to the family member, and their reactions then impact the well-being of the therapist. And so the second picture is a mobile, and I always use that as an example of recursiveness, meaning if we have an impact on one of these things, the rest will move in an attempt to regain balance or homeostasis. And so I include this to say that this young woman, who is this counselor, is really a member of multiple teams. And one team is her coworkers, and if she begins to experience struggles because of the relationship that she has with this person and the trauma that this person is discussing and exhibiting, that the fact that the therapist may begin to have symptoms, may begin to change, will impact their work team, and it will have an impact on that team. And so again, the balance of the mobile. Well, it's also going to impact the family that this young woman is going home to. And as I've had a couple examples in my career when I was working with Vietnam veterans, where they would tell me stories that I just had no way to be prepared for. And my family would say, I don't know what's going on with you, but it's really different. You're not who you were. And so I would have to then kind of address those fears that I had, and that anxiety that was evolving, and the fact that I was constantly thinking about my clients. I had a hard time letting go of that. I think this is really important for all of us, that compassion fatigue doesn't just make this person want to leave their job, but it impacts the function of their work team and the family that they're going home to. So it's really important for us to process these things. Work-life balance. There is a book out there that says there's no such thing. I think we can have work-life balance, but I think our work in the addiction field, with alterations in census and new clients coming in every month or every week, or however your work environment is, makes any kind of balance really hard. And that if we're not taking care of ourselves, it makes it impossible. And so I just like this quote to begin to talk about that idea of work-life balance. It says, family systems theory suggests that family members are interdependent, with the well-being of one member influence the functioning and well-being of other family members through direct and indirect pathways. And that is what also happens in our work environment. And so it is important to recognize that the more impacted I am, the more I'm going to impact those people around me, that there is this sort of ripple effect in this process. So, okay. So examples of secondary trauma are vicarious trauma, which is a single member of a system. This therapist that you can see in the picture is affected due to regular contact with traumatized individuals. So the fact that she has empathy and has the ability to co-experience many of the same experiences that this person has, plus she has compassion, which is the willingness to bear witness and to be in relationship, therapeutic relationship, professional relationship with this person, with the belief that she can have a positive impact in this person's life. And so that the accumulation of memories, the accumulation of clients' stories and the material that they share, that affects and is affected by the therapist's perspectives on the world. And so the more I am interacting with traumatic material, the more I begin to accumulate that trauma, and the more it begins to impact me. And I think, I don't think it's all that conscious, to be quite honest with you. The times that I've really struggled with it was very much a slow, gradual process that impacted me in ways that I didn't even recognize. That it did it required me to have people who cared enough about me to say. And at one point, I was a clinical director of a psychiatric hospital in Florida, and one of my employees came in and was telling me about the death of a client that had been released a couple weeks before, and he just wanted me to know. And I immediately went into risk management mode and started asking, when was the client here, and the employee, who I had known for a long time, said, "Wow, that is not how I expected you to react." And he said, I've known you to be a caring professional, and I thought your first question would be, how's the family taking it? And I said, yeah. I said, someone has to be the risk manager here. But as he left, and as we had our conversation, I began to realize that I really had begun to change. And I became more controlling, and I became more hypervigilant, and I began to experience trauma symptoms. And again, I grew up in a family where there was trauma, so I did have that pre-existing traumatic foundation. So that's what we would call vicarious trauma. Chiasmal trauma is a very different concept. And chiasm is a term that means the crossing of two paths. And so chiasmal trauma happens when an individual. Um, so chiasmal trauma was first the term was coined by David Kisher, and David was a student at Purdue, and he was doing research with the Cleveland Police Department. And he was doing research on when something really catastrophic would happen to one member, like a shooting or a police officer down or something, that how it rippled through the police force, and how the trauma to one member of a team has the potential to create significant trauma responses in others. And the what looks like a Ferris wheel on the right-hand side of that is an example of a chiasmal trauma that I was involved in a treatment center when I was younger. And I wasn't that much younger, but so we had two clients who came into the facility on the same day. They came together. They didn't come together, but they both came the same day. They went to detox together. They went to residential together. They went to partial together, and then they went to IOP together. And they were living in an apartment. They had become best friends in their recovery, and everything seemed to be fine. And the one roommate came home from work, couldn't find the other, and found him to be hanging in the closet of their bedroom. And he had committed suicide. And so when I started looking at, so clearly the client called and let us know that this had happened. And so I was trying to decide who's going to be debriefed. Like, who had the closest relationship to these two guys. And what became really clear to me was that they had gone through so many different programs in our organization that every single department in the organization had had contact with them. Just going around that circle, from the residential staff to the IOP staff to the partial staff. The family staff, their families had gone through the family program. The nurses knew them from the detox, the medical team, the psychiatry team, the admissions team. And so here we have the death of one client by suicide that impacted every department in the organization that I was working in. And so that's an example of a chiasmal trauma, where one event ripples through the whole place. And you can see how that could be such a devastating blow to an organization. So what are the signs and symptoms of kind of burnout and secondary trauma? So let's just start with who's at risk. And the research would tell us that anyone who has a previous or unresolved trauma in their background, women tend to have higher rates of compassion fatigue than men. Anyone who's highly empathetic, anyone who's new to the field, so like all of you who are new to this field, or are more inexperienced in trying to balance these really difficult issues, individuals who have a lack of training, individuals who work in an environment that is not very supportive, and then individuals who work in communities that have significant communal trauma, racial trauma, poverty, high levels of crime, those kinds of transgenerational or historical traumas tend to have a higher likelihood of having compassion fatigue. And so common symptoms, I'm going to skip, I have some redundancy here. So these are symptoms of compassion fatigue that I think it's a better way of kind of looking at it. Okay. Physical symptoms, headaches, digestive problems. Think about digestive problems. Why would you have digestive problems? Well, if you think about the fight, flight, freeze response and the sympathetic nervous system response, all the blood is leaving the viscera, the internal organs, stomach, and rushing to the prefrontal or to the body to fight and flight, and it impacts kind of thinking, prefrontal cortex functioning, those kinds of things. And if I'm in a constant state of fight or flight because of high anxiety associated with secondary trauma, and that the work environment isn't as supportive as I had hoped it would be, then you need blood to digest food. And so a lot of individuals have gastrointestinal problems, diarrhea, constipation, those kinds of issues because of chronic stress. Muscle tension, sleep disturbances, that's a common one. I've done research on the secondary trauma of critical care nurses, and they talk about dreaming about the critical care environment that I've studied is pediatric, and nurses will talk about dreaming about kids and those kinds of things. Emotional symptoms, mood swings, restlessness, irritability, oversensitivity, anxiety, excessive use of substances. This is where we'll see people return to smoking or return to or have experience a lapse or a resumption of their addiction that they've been in recovery from. Depression, anxiety, anger, resentments, all kinds of emotional symptoms of hopelessness, helplessness, poor concentration. To be quite honest, it's my opinion that when we see individuals who make ethical mistakes, I think, I always give the example, I've worked in a lot of hospitals, that when a nurse makes a medication error, we tend to want to retrain them. And I always thought, well, that's silly. This person didn't make these mistakes. What was going on in the half hour before the mistake was made? What's been going on in this person's life in the days leading up to the medical error? And so often when we really begin to look at these things, that it is an accumulation of a stress response that has been building and building to the person beginning to experience an impairment of judgment, making decisions that they just would not have made, putting themselves into that list in the Mental Health Act, or the prohibited behaviors, dual relationships, those kinds of things. So workplace-related symptoms, avoidance or dread of working with certain patients or in certain situations, reduced ability to feel empathy towards patients, frequent use of sick days, lack of joy in the job, exaggerated sense of responsibility that somehow that they could have, should have, would have, been more successful or in helping that person. And then the last is, there's questionable ethics, impaired ability to make decisions. Remember, here's the double bind of it. And so I just said that the person who has compassion fatigue is the last person to know they have it. Well, we're responsible to be able to practice in an ethical way to make sure that we are not impaired in our work, and if we don't know that. So it really is in the best interest of not just the employee or the client, but it's in the best interest of everyone to be really trained in compassion fatigue and to have the doors open to these kinds of discussions. That's one of the issues at the Foundry is, we've done a lot of training, and the idea of, I think it's the team's responsibility. Meaning, if I see an employee, a friend, a colleague who's really struggling, it's my job to go to them and say, hey, can we go get some coffee? I want to talk to you. Like, I'm worried about you. And so, but it is ultimately our responsibility to be practicing in a competent way, right? The other thing is, these are just some symptoms that we see that are consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, and so the re-experiencing of traumatic events, and the intrusive thoughts, nightmares, dreaming about clients, dreaming about struggles, avoidance or numbing of reminders, feeling depressed, dissociating, depersonalizing, efforts to avoid thoughts and feelings associated with where I heard those stories. Again, that might be a reason for absenteeism. Diminished interest in activities that we have always used to practice taking care of ourselves. Running, exercise, those kinds of things. And the last one is really about our families and that detached estrangement from others. Hopefully everyone has someone in their life that when we begin to experience these symptoms and these patterns of avoidance or pulling away from the people that we care about, that those people who we care about are going to care enough to say, hey, come on back. I'm worried about you. And then the next of the trauma symptoms that we see really is persistent arousal, anxiety, hypervigilance, irritability, difficulty concentrating. So all of those are significant and real and realistic. Okay. I'm gonna just show you one slide real quickly just for time. These are the symptoms of organizational trauma. And who gets promoted in many organizations is the person who's been there the longest, that has been a really good therapist. And oftentimes those individuals are ready to move out of client care and into more administrative roles and clinical supervision roles and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, sometimes they take their compassion fatigue with them into those roles. And so our what I call the 5 R's, the rules, roles, routines, rituals, and relationships or boundaries become impacted by the amount of compassion fatigue in the organization. And so some of the symptoms that we see in traumatized organizations are high absenteeism, workers' comp claims are high, changes in coworker relationships, inability for teams to work well together. Challenging individuals and staff members begin to challenge the organizational rules and regulations. They stop adhering to policies and procedures, start developing workarounds, which are those processes of the way the policies and procedures are written. Takes too long to do something, so I'm going to just cut some of those steps out and do it my way. Rampant rumors and gossip, more of an aggressive lack of empathy. I was working at a hospital in Florida, and I was working. I was the clinical director of the Department of Psychiatry, and I was asked to consult in our intensive care unit. And it was an adult intensive care unit. And one of the families had a complaint that they wanted to talk about, and they wanted to they wanted to be assured that we would never allow this nurse to work with their mother again. And when I found out who the nurse was, she was probably the best nurse we had. But she had been around for a really long time. When I say that, she was probably the best from a technique and skill set. But she was a kind of a grizzled old nurse, she had been around for a long time. And they didn't feel that she was too gruff, she didn't have enough empathy. And so, a lot of times those folks that have the greatest skills will become less empathetic and more burned out, more exhausted. And they have great skills, but they're not necessarily seen as being highly effective or efficient. So what do we do? So in my, I consult with companies about compassion fatigue, and I have always found that the best thing we can do is to begin to create awareness. And for organizations to, I usually try to have the CEO of the organization send out a memo or something to every employee that says, hey, we've become really aware that this is we're working in an environment that has a high likelihood of the potential for burnout and secondary trauma, and that as an organization we're going to do some work to make sure that everyone gets what they need. And so, developing one of my favorites is to develop a support group for employees that you don't just go when you're feeling bad, you go when you're feeling good to be able to support those that are struggling, because who knows what next week is going to mean for us, right? So we want to make sure that we are really giving people permission to take care of themselves. And that's not always an easy thing to do. So I think these 4 steps are really important to preventing compassion fatigue. And the first one is taking stock of your stressors and really beginning to look at what are the parts of my job that do create the greatest stress for me. That, is it the census that I have, the number of cases that I have to work with, the complexity of the cases, the lack of supervision, those kinds of things. And I have worksheets that I can share with you about how to help people begin to look at those stressors. And I find that doing like lunch and learns and things like that, where you have different employees all kind of coming together to talk about, what are the stressors, and here's what I do about them, and here's what you do about them, and beginning to build almost a database of coping strategies and self-care ideas and self-care activities. The second step, looking for ways to enhance self-care and work-life balance. And that idea of, if I understand my stressors, then I am much more equipped to begin to look at, so what do I do about this? And so we're going to talk about self-care in a couple minutes. Developing resiliency skills is the next step. And resilience is not... this is my favorite quote on resilience, and this is from Moby Dick, Robert Louis Stevenson. Life is not a matter of having good cards, but of playing a poor hand well. Resilience isn't, I'm going to set myself up to not have stress. Resilience is, I'm going to develop skills that allow me to manage stress better than I ever did before. A process of connectedness, of linking to people who have similar interests, and ultimately to life itself. And so these are just some of the skills, resiliency, kind of not skills, but aspects of resilient individuals kind of makeup, if you will, traits, if you will. People who tend to be more self-aware, fearlessly looking within and facing the truth about how they feel. I'm depressed today, I'm sad today, I'm really happy today, but being willing to own those skills. Resilient people don't let their fears and their emotions get in the way. A lot of people think that resilient people don't have fear. Well, that's not true at all. They have fear. They just have different ways of managing it. Internal locus of control, freedom to make decisions based on their own beliefs. What I call functional dependence, the idea of being able to say yes when I mean yes and no when I mean no. The ability to functionally ask for help, that if I don't need your help, I'm not going to ask, but if I'm asking because I really need it. Engaging in social activities both on the job and outside of the job, maintaining friends outside of the work environment, maintaining interests outside of the work environment, exercise programs, hiking, golf, all those things that people like to do, cycling, Um, Flexibility, maintaining a solution orientation rather than always being focused on the problem, the ability to think outside the box, the ability to sit with a problem until we can find out a way to, and to ask as many people as we can, to not be impulsive, to urgently make it go away. Sense of humor, being able to laugh with ourselves, at ourselves at times, rather than that cynicism of laughing at other people. And that I had a student when I was on the faculty at the University of Colorado, Denver, and I was in charge of all the internships and the practicums, and she came to our first. She had been assigned to a community mental health center in Denver, and she came to our first internship class, and she said, "I'm just here to let you know that I'm quitting. I'm quitting the program." And I said, "What are you talking about? You can't just quit the program." And she said, "If I'm going to turn out as negative as those people in that mental health center are, I want no part of this." And she said they make fun of the clients, they're cynical, they're sarcastic. And it really opened up a door for this really good discussion about compassion fatigue. And she stayed, and she's graduated, and she's doing great. But pretty astute young woman to be able to say, wow, these people are negative. And so often that's the case. And then the last of the resiliency traits is a real sense of personal ethic. And so we have, at the highest level of standard, we have professional ethics, and it's the minimum standard. We have the law, and it is personal ethic, our belief systems, our ability to be to deal with our feelings, our ability to engage in social support, our ability to look honestly at ourselves. That those are the things that drive us from a personal ethics standpoint. And so when we violate, when I was teaching again at UCD, I used to teach ethics, and it was like, everyone has had an ethics class, but all these people who have been sanctioned, how did they run into the problems that they're running into? And so that was always I would say, which one of you is going to be sanctioned? Because statistically, in a class, there's going to be people that are sanctioned. And so I think it's really important to recognize I can become more resilient, but it takes work. And so we just have a couple minutes left. So the last of the activities that I wanted to talk about for compassion fatigue are self-care activities. And this is one of the things that we have really seen as being a preventative and a curative factor for individuals who experience compassion fatigue. And so when I saw this is out of a workbook on vicarious trauma by Svakny and Perlman. And Lori Ann Perlman and her colleague, not Savitny, was McCann was her name. They were the first people to use the term vicarious trauma back in the early 90s. And they looked at these sort of 4 core areas in which wellness activities and self-care activities kind of focus. And these are just lists. You can create your own. But physical self-care, eating healthy, exercise, getting a massage, getting enough sleep, taking time to be intimate, to be sexual, to be connected to other human beings, to get enough sleep, take a vacation. In many environments, people don't take vacation because they feel that if I go on vacation, that I'm going to leave my team down, that people have to pick up my slack, and so someone's going to have to take my cases while I'm gone. That's not a sufficient reason to not go on vacation. that's really up to your supervisor and your team to work out those things. But people need to take their vacations so that they can recharge their batteries and not be at risk. Psychological self-care. And remember, again, it's your responsibility to practice safely. And so this isn't just like a good idea. This is something that we are held to as part of our certifications and our licenses, and the law in Colorado. So again, like, this is important. Psychological self-care, taking time to reflect, quiet time, thinking, journaling, going to therapy, decreasing life stress, finding ways to reduce that, being curious, trying new things, being excited by various activities. Spiritual self-care, finding a spiritual connection or community, being open to inspiration, being open to not knowing, which is my favorite of them all. Meditation, prayer, and then relationship care, working on our families, spending time with family members, staying in contact with other important people in our lives, seeking out comforting activities with the important people in our lives, and letting people get to know you. And so miscellaneous are things that people have told me over the years that they do. Receiving supervision. That's one of the things that a lot of people really look at supervision as a means of self-care. And so, we begin to look at normative needs, and these are from our notes, administrative supervision, addressing managerial, ethical issues, codes of ethics, policies, procedures, documentation, those kinds of things. Formative needs are educational, learning opportunities, and development needs. How do we help? That's clinical supervision. How do we conceptualize a case? How do we pick interventions? What models of care do we use? And then the third is restorative needs. And I think this is the one that gets left out a lot. Restorative supervision helps the caregiver regain their sense of psychological, physical, social, and spiritual well-being. And in class, I talked about the discrimination model of supervision and the idea that there is a role there's the consultant role, the teacher role, and the counselor role. And the consultant is normative needs or organizational or administrative supervision. The teacher is formative needs. The idea of continuing education, which is another one of our ethical requirements. And then the counselor is dealing with restorative needs. And so I think those are all really important. So clinical supervision should not be something that is something we have to do. It should be something that we benefit from and that we look forward to doing. Other things that people have told me, gardening, playing music, hobbies, watching feel-good movies, attending professional development, laughing with coworkers. I've heard people talk about riding their motorcycles and fishing and boating and all kinds of things that people do, hiking. Whatever you need to do to feel good is really good. So I think that's it from a lecture perspective. I'll see you in class. Thanks.